Hi everybody, if your newsfeed is anything like mine, you've probably seen a lot of content about Web3 and a lot of it may be too good to be true. So in this video, I want to dial the volume down a bit and get down to fundamentals. Let's focus on what Web3 is from a technical point of view and how it will help us out as developers. So hopefully by the end of our time together, you'll have a good idea of not only what Web3 is, but also what it isn't. So let's go ahead and get started. So to answer the question about what is Web3, it is very helpful, at least in my point of view, to focus on what isn't Web3. There's a lot of things we've been hearing about Web3, a lot of it attributed to newsworthy events, and some of it may be very tangentially related to Web3, but it probably shouldn't be. So let's go ahead and focus on what some of those items are. The biggest item in the room really is around cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Dogecoin, meme coins, and the variety of other coins we've been hearing about for quite some time. These are all applications and layers built on top of the foundation that Web3 is promising to create. So they are part of the story, but they definitely would not be something we'd cover in the very early chapters, and definitely not with the level of attention that it has been getting when we think about Web3. Related to that, you have NFTs, non-fungible tokens, such as the one that Beeple sold of his artwork, or of the very famous programmatically generated avatars of apes that Bored Ape Yacht Club has created. All of these, again, are often clubbed together with Web3, but they're not directly related. They are, in many ways, end results of multiple layers of abstraction that enable these things to be created from the foundations that Web3 creates. And of course, I cannot leave this topic without bringing up some of the more casual, humorous kind of activities as well, such as these laser eyes, which in many ways is kind of an homage and allegiance to the kind of decentralized world that Web3 tends to promote, but it's not in any way technically related to Web3. You can absolutely be very productive as a Web3 participant or a developer without having to do anything with lightning or lasers or any sort of that kind of stuff. And of course, the color scheme that almost every Web3 project seems to use, it almost seems as if like they all met in a secret meeting and decided these are 12 colors we're all going to be applying to our projects, and they didn't include or invite all the rest of us. So definitely not related to Web3, but you can definitely see a case where a lot of the applications that are Web3 related have a color scheme that falls within this range of blues and pinks. So a lot of interesting things to just keep in mind, but again, not related. So with that out of the way, let's now focus back on the question, what is Web3? So at a very high level, Web3 is a proposed evolution of where the web is going. And we think about evolution, we kind of think about a past, a present, and a future. And so the web that we typically love and know has been broken up into three eras. One of them is the Web 1.0 era. This is really the beginning of the web, where we had the building up of tools and infrastructure to create websites like Yahoo, or the traditional websites that were around 10, 15 years ago, where we saw content that was really created by a central authority, and then we really had no ability to modify that content. All we could see was consume it, we could print it, we could email it, but what my interaction with that website would not change your interaction with the website. It was all very different, which in many ways is categorized by read-only. This was a read-only web where we can see and touch, but we can't actually modify. And that led to Web 2.0, which fixed one of the biggest shortcomings of the first version of the web, which is the lack of social interaction. It is here we saw the rise of user-generated content and social networks, where the content we saw was not from a central group of individuals, but it was from people like you and I. The entire platforms are built around content that I post, that you interact with, and content you post, I interact with. All these companies that came up during this era, what they provided were easy to use tools for me to make it easier to like some content or add some commentary or post a thread, and then have others come in and interact with it in very meaningful ways. So the typical Facebooks and Instagrams and Pinterests and YouTubes are all in many ways the beneficiaries of all the infrastructure and tools that were created to enable both reading content but also writing content, where my interaction with the content can definitely shape what you end up seeing as well. So this is called the read and write era of Web 2.0. Now, what this era kind of brought up were many questions around ownership. Who owns this content? What if the content magically has to go away? What if the site that we posted all this content in, all of our interactions are on, happen to disappear? What if Instagram disappeared tomorrow? Or what if GeoCities, a real case, that many of us had our content on end up going away, we lost a lot of that content. Years and years of information was ultimately lost. How do we ensure that kind of thing doesn't happen again? And that's where the idea of decentralization. This is where Web 3.0 comes in, where it takes the best of Web 1.0, best of Web 2.0, and adds a layer of decentralization, which means that everything we do is less about what any individual company or group of individuals thinks needs to be done, but it's more around how we decide to use information, how we decide to share the parts of our lives that we think is appropriate, and we own full ownership of that content, which is a very complicated area that we'll touch upon in the technical conversation about how all these things are enabled. So we have to visualize what does centralized world mean? It means that you have information that is centralized in a handful of locations, which means if those locations were to go offline, or if the owners or administrators of those locations decide that tomorrow the color blue is no longer something we're going to allow on our networks, that means that you are negatively impacted with no real influence on the final outcome. What Web3 tries to solve is by changing this model where everything has a common node into something that's both decentralized and distributed, which means that whatever information that you're accessing is not unique to that location, but is now copied and replicated across millions and billions of other locations, which means that if ever a change were to happen that would cause that information to go away, it's very difficult to officially pull that off, because that means that every copy of it floating around needs to be adjusted as well. If you ever use peer-to-peer services like BitTorrent, for example, these are all early ideas of this notion of having content that is distributed and decentralized with no any one individual having an abnormal amount of influence or control. And that's one of the core principles of Web3. Now, how do we take that utopian vision of full decentralization, full distributed nature of networks, and how do we make that a reality? And that goes one level deeper into the technical layer, which I'm going to talk about as part of the architecture. When we think of web apps or just modern apps today, there are often two parts to it. One is the client. This is the thing that runs on our phone, on our laptops and desktops, our smart thermostats, TVs, and so on, where you have the visuals, you might have user interaction. The very limited computing is often done on these devices to enable just client-side interactions. But the bulk of the heavy lifting, the storage of data, the processing of AI and ML models, all these things are done remotely on servers, really powerful computers that are often separated by a network connection. This client-server model has really defined how we think about applications since almost the beginnings, for almost like 40, 50 years. And with Web3, this model doesn't change a whole lot. If you're on the client side, if you're looking at things purely from what do I see on my screen, what can I interact with, things will very much look the same. What is going to be different though is what happens in the back end, what happens in the server layer, because when we're moving from centralized services to decentralized services, a lot of things need to be changed, a lot of things need to evolve, and some things we do today will need to be discarded. And this transition from a centralized world that we typically have been dealing with to a decentralized world is going to be massive, because if we trace back to how we got to where we are in terms of technical capabilities that we have, there were decades of investments and large amounts of money that were invested and created by many governments and corporations and individuals to have us have the capabilities that we have. And so replicating them and changing them to be decentralized will not happen overnight. This is going to be a long-term story. And if we take a look at how we model the applications we see, we have this traditional OSI diagram where you have the physical layer at the very bottom, and then with each layer of abstraction, you go all the way top with the application layer, which is where a lot of us who tend to work on web technologies or client-side technologies tend to live. But in order to make that layer happen effectively, all the layers below it need to be effectively created, all the way from the hardware to the operating system to the abstractions to the frameworks and ultimately the applications that we end up building, whether it is the tools and programs and so on. This exact model needs to be replicated and evolved to work in this decentralized world. And this is a great chart I like from Coinbase, where they took the 7 layers and tried to approximately map them to similar foundational layers that are needed to make applications in this world work. You have the protocol layer at the very bottom, which is really the blockchain architecture. And with each layer above, you start having more of the infrastructure like file systems, and then operating systems, and then actual applications like browsers, and all the things that need to be created as a part of it. And so it's a rapidly moving space, but you can see the transition is starting to happen where we're building those missing late pieces, individually. Now, to continue further though, there's a lot of terminology that I've been accidentally or deliberately actually kind of throwing in here. And so let's take a step back and discuss how all these various terms that you may encounter, either from what I just spoke about right now or what you will see in the future, how it all relates. So let's start with blockchain. The blockchain is one of the more foundational pieces of Web3. And think of the blockchain as a large hard drive. It's a large hard drive that allows us to store data, but the difference between what a blockchain provides and what your typical database that you might be using provides is this. The blockchain only allows you to store and read data. You cannot delete and you cannot modify. And so if you need to modify something, if you delete something, what you really do is you create a new entry in the blockchain, and in that you specify that the old data is no longer correct. This is the new source of truth, but the old data will always exist, which means that there's a certain level of permanence with what we do on the blockchain, where every single activity, every single item can be traced back to the very beginning, and there's no ability for someone to go in and change the history, change the records of what happened in the past. So there's a lot of implications and benefits and cons, actually, in terms of how that might change our day-to-day lives and activities that we may pursue. And the next layer on top of the blockchain is something called smart contracts. And a smart contract, think of it as an app running on the server that reacts to an if-else statement when it happens. And this app has one job primarily, which is to make sure that it reacts and modifies something or adds something to the blockchain itself. So the backend code is the smart contract, and then the full app in its entirety, both the backend capabilities and the front-end capabilities, typically the UI that we might interact with, is known as a DApp or a decentralized app. And this is a full-fledged application whose backend is a smart contract, but whose front ends allow us to interact with the smart contract in meaningful ways. A way of visualizing this would be that think of a web page that you might have. You have an input field where you can type in a name and hit submit. So you type in the name, you hit submit. The UI for doing all of that is the front end of our decentralized app. And when you hit submit, that name gets added to the blockchain. The capability for making that work historically might have been a script like a PHP script or a cloud function or something like that. But in this world, it is a smart contract that takes that input, mediates, and does all the magic needed to get that information added to the blockchain. Now, the way we actually interact with the blockchain is use a wallet. A wallet is something like Apple Wallet or Google Pay that allows us to pay for activities that we perform in Web3. It's almost like an in-app payment mechanism. And the currency is in the form of tokens like Ethereum and Solana, etc. So earlier on I said cryptocurrencies aren't the foundational piece of Web3. That is still correct. It's only when you get to the layer where you're not only at the application layer, but you're one level above it, what do I do within the application, that the direct impact of having a cryptocurrency really comes into play. And the reason is this. Just like when we're driving from our home to the grocery store to do something, unless you're driving a vehicle that happens to run on zero energy, which who knows, the future might have all these things, you're using a unit of currency known as gas. It could be gas in the terms of fossil fuels, or it could be electricity in the form of an electric vehicle, but there's some unit of energy, unit of currency that you are paying to go from one point, from your home to the store or any other destination. And on the blockchain, in the Web3 world, everything you do, all the activities you perform have a similar concept, and that is very related to real life, very much called gas. And this is independent of things to do, such as buying something. So think of the wallet as something that labels in-app purchases of things you do within an app, and then the gas is the amount you pay just to be able to have the opportunity to do something in the app. And so what I really glossed over are a lot of things that we just haven't fully figured out. what is the performance going to be like? What about this database that everyone keeps adding data to, never modifying or removing? How will that be fast? How will it be scalable? Today we have very quick access to information. I use Dropbox, I use Apple Storage, I use Box. I use all these various capabilities to store information and get at the information very quickly. How will that work? What is the energy consumption going to be like? All of these machines running together to make very simple data requests possible cannot be very cheap. They all have to be running, to be doing something. Conflict resolution. Who owns the source of truth? What if there's a dispute? In a world where you don't have central authorities or central arbiters, how will we be able to adjust where you and I may have a disagreement about the validity of some information there? Offline and online, how do we ensure that when I have network access, I'm able to be a respectable member of the blockchain? But what if I'm in a subway or I lose access for whatever reason? How can I ensure the data that I'm creating is still in sync and in a form that is accurate when it ultimately gets consistent with the blockchain itself? The number 5 is tangible use case. What is a situation that I cannot do today that only the blockchain and Web3 will really enable? There's some examples out there, but it's definitely good for each of us to think about what are the bigger things that are very uniquely suited to that, because today we can still use traditional centralized services to create a lot of what the blockchain examples are being proposed, often cheaper, often faster. So let me think about. And so the transition is going to be massive. To repeat what I mentioned a few slides earlier, it's going to take time, but the foundations are being set. We have companies, we have people looking into various parts of it. And so what we'll really see is a hybrid world where centralized and decentralized services coexist. And we may never leave that hybrid world because there are a lot of benefits that centralized services provide, especially around conflict resolution or being performant, that may not be completely fine to replace, but there are some benefits that decentralization also provides, like data permanency, they may want to kind of adopt as well. So a solution might be something that is in the middle, as opposed to the centralized extreme on one end and a purely utopian decentralized view on the other end. So now it gets to the topic that I think a lot of us here care a lot about, which is web developers. How do we ensure that we as web developers can somehow adapt to the changes that are proposed here? So the biggest change is really that the server side, what happens in the backend? How does authentication work? How does data storage work? How do we make notifications and text messages and all of these things? How will that work in a decentralized world? A lot to figure out there. But what doesn't change a whole lot is the client-side experience. People will still need UI. They will still need ways of building that UI and being able to interact with it and being able to see it in a performant way, in an accessible way, all the things that we've been doing for quite some time. So what this means is that all the things we've been learning for quite some time about DOM, React, or frameworks like React and Vue or CSS, accessibility, all these things are going to be completely relevant. You will not have to relearn them, you will not have to forget them. Of course, there might be techniques that Web3 enables that might add on to your knowledge here, but it won't be a case where everything you've known and loved, hopefully, for quite some time, will have to be relearned or discarded. And the things that will be different, of course, is that many ways of serving content, techniques like server-side rendering or static site generation and other similar ways of rendering and displaying content, they may need to adapt, but hopefully the frameworks will take care of that for you and you don't have to worry too much about it. Just like if you're using something like Next.js or Nuxt, you don't worry about it today. So the biggest changes will be in the server and backend. Traditional web servers and CDNs are replaced with decentralized blockchain-aware variants. What is the impact to us? I don't know. Something for us to keep our eyes on. Second will be authentication. It's going to be big because when you rely on anonymous verification, which the blockchain supports, as opposed to OAuth, where you have Twitter or Google or Facebook-based authentication methods or username and password, those have been historically what we use today. They may not be what we end up using in the future, especially if in a decentralized world, you don't want to have any one central authority be responsible for managing your credentials. So there's maybe some changes there. And the nice thing is just as we're seeing with technologies over the past many decades, there will be abstractions, there will be guidance in forms of tools and frameworks that will make a lot of these things easier. We're already seeing examples like Web3.js or Ether.js, which makes it a little easy to interact with these blockchain-based backends, and they abstract away a lot of the complications around authentication, around storage, around messaging, networking, and so on. So there's a lot more to be done though, because if we look at the average Web3 tutorial today, they are dozens of pages long and the videos are several hours long. I mean, this introductory video on what Web3 is probably in the dozens of minutes at this point. And setup of all of these applications involves many steps that keep changing constantly. Where's my one-click setup where I just push a button, come back 5 minutes later, and then I have everything ready for me to build a blockchain-based app, a nice code editor, a nice preview window, and the ability to just deploy it to the blockchain and be able to share it with my friends. What is that nice end-to-end experience going to be like? We don't have it yet. It's still very early days. And so if you're looking for a one-click setup, you're still a ways away from there. But the thing is, the things you can do today is really to keep going deeper into front technologies and continue to learn all that you can, because that's an investment that's going to pay off today. It's going to pay off in the future. And the next one is to continue to think about a killer app idea that'll only work in Web3. And here's the important part: start building towards it, because it won't be easy. I've mentioned there's no easy setup, no hand-holding right now, but the best way to learn oftentimes is through that struggle of trying to figure out things that work and then trying to figure out things that don't work. And so by you starting to build an application now and really getting an idea of where the rough edges are and resolving them, you'll be miles ahead of anyone else who's going to come in later on and just jump in with a happy solution, because when things go wrong, which in programming, things always do go wrong, it's great for you to be able to rely on that history and troubleshooting steps makes this work. And the last one is just to be thoughtful about who you follow and listen to. The world of Web3 has a lot of positive players in it, but there are also a handful of people who might be using it for personal financial gain or just doing things that aren't what I consider particularly ethical. So just be careful about what you're following into, and if it sounds too good to be true, just like with everything in real life, it's probably too good to be true, even in the metaverse, the Web3 world. If you have any questions, the best place to discuss is on forum.group.com, where I and others would be happy to help you out. You can see content on Web3 and other development topics on group.com. And lastly, you can follow me on Twitter at Karupa, and many other networks where at Karupa typically might be pointing to me on bite-sized updates on technical topics that I'm fiddling with at the moment. And lastly, if you found this information interesting, you may also find some of the books I've written equally interesting. And a lot of them cover a lot of front-end topics, which in a Web3 world will still very much be relevant. You can find them in paperback and Kindle editions, and some of them are actually pretty good. Ringing endorsement there from the author himself. And with that, I will see you all next time.